AJ Cortez had the kind of grin that lit up a phone screen, not because it was warm, but because it made you wonder what insult was coming next. At 24, he had already figured out how to turn every sparring session, every workout, and every half-baked thought into content. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a showman. His clips popped up everywhere on TikTok, YouTube, even cable sports shows, highlight reels of his lightning combinations, followed by a cocky smirk and a joke at someone else's expense. The kids loved it. They shared his trash talk like gospel, replaying every word as if it were a prophecy. Older folks didn't see it the same way. To them, AJ sounded less like a martial artist and more like a comedian who didn't know when to stop. He loved to point out old black and white footage of karate or judo demonstrations and laugh. He would slow down a move and say, "This guy looks like he's dancing in his sleep." Then he'd post a split-screen clip of himself throwing a spinning elbow and knock out some amateur. The contrast was brutal, and it worked. Followers poured in by the thousands, and every post was a fresh chance to jab at the people he claimed were stuck in museums. The more popular he became, the more daring his targets got. He stopped picking on nameless instructors or random dojos. He went after legends. Bruce Lee, he claimed, wouldn't last 30 seconds in a modern cage. Traditional taekwondo was, in his words, fancy, kicking in pajamas. And when he mentioned Chuck Norris, his voice dripped with mockery. He called him a relic, a movie cowboy who never fought anyone that mattered. The line hit like a grenade across martial arts circles. Older fans who had grown up watching Norris in theaters or seen him win real tournaments in the 60s took it as sacrilege. Younger fans ate it up and pressed for more. AJ delivered with a smirk, asking why anyone should listen to a man who hadn't gone viral since rotary phones were in style. Prescott, Arizona wasn't exactly the center of the combat sports world, but it had history. Every year, martial artists of all stripes gathered for a conference there, a blend of tradition and innovation. Old masters in crisp uniforms bowed on stage to demonstrate kata, while young fighters held workshops on ground and pound techniques or high-altitude cardio. It was meant to bridge generations, to remind everyone that fighting wasn't just about fists and belts, but about passing down lessons. This year, though, a storm brewed before the first panel even started, and that storm had AJ's name written all over it. He arrived with cameras rolling his entourage, trailing like shadows. He didn't wear a uniform. He showed up in designer sneakers, gym shorts, and a hoodie with his own logo printed across the chest. He moved through the conference hall like a rock star, not bowing, not shaking hands, just flashing that grin and letting the lens catch every move. When he passed a booth where a gray-haired man demonstrated sword, Kata AJ leaned in close enough for the microphone to pick him up. He whispered, "What year is this again? 1740. The crew laughed, and within an hour, the clip was online. Views exploded. Older attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some muttered about respect, about how a man who didn't understand roots couldn't claim to be a martial artist. AJ loved that. He fed on the tension. It gave him more ammunition. He told anyone who would listen that tradition was dead weight holding fighters back. He compared bowing to shaking hands with ghosts. He said kata was shadowboxing for people afraid of real opponents. Each statement got louder, each reaction stronger, and every moment was caught on camera. It wasn't just his words. AJ was good. That was the part nobody could deny. He had the speed, the reflexes, the killer instinct. Clips of his fights showed him dismantling opponents with precision, dropping them with knees and hooks before they even knew what hit them. He trained like a machine and carried himself like he already belonged among the greats. His arrogance wasn't built on air. It had muscle behind it, and that made him dangerous. People could dismiss his words as noise, but when they saw him fight, they knew there was truth in the talent. The question was whether talent alone made him worthy of the stage he stood on. The tension built as the conference went on. Organizers had tried to market the event as unity between old and new, but AJ turned it into a battlefield. He didn't just attend. He hijacked it. He went live during panel discussions, whispering jokes and rolling his eyes. He laughed as a judo master explained the philosophy of balance. He cut into a speech about discipline with a staged yawn. The comments on his feed exploded with laughter. The hall itself was filled with silence, so thick you could feel its weight pressing down. There was a generational split that no one could ignore. Younger fans in the audience laughed nervously, glancing at their phones to catch his feed. Older practitioners shook their heads, folded their arms, and remembered a time when stepping into a dojo meant humility. Some left the hall altogether. Others stayed not because they wanted to, but because they refused to give him the satisfaction of clearing the room. It was no longer a conference. It was a standoff. AJ loved every second. This was exactly where he thrived. He wasn't just fighting with fists. He was fighting with presence, with words, with every smirk and shrug. To him, this wasn't disrespect. It was evolution. He believed he was tearing down old myths so a new kind of fighter could rise. To the elders watching it was arrogance wrapped in skill, disrespect disguised as progress. And in the middle of it all, his name trended worldwide. That was proof enough for AJ to be right. But beneath the noise, beneath the applause, and the anger, there was a quiet tension that even he couldn't see. Somewhere in that same conference, in that same city, the very man he mocked had arrived. He wasn't making speeches. He wasn't live streaming. He wasn't even on the stage. Chuck Norris was simply watching. And that silence, though AJ didn't realize it yet, was louder than all his noise. The memorial for Master Lee was meant to be a quiet affair. The hall in Prescott had been draped in banners bearing the old man's name, and rows of chairs were filled with people who had trained under him or learned from his students. Veterans in press jackets sat shoulder to shoulder with men and women in crisp uniforms. The air carried the weight of respect, not for celebrity or titles, but for a teacher who had shaped lives. Stories were told of discipline, kindness, and wisdom. Each speaker bowed before the portrait at the front, lit by a single candle. Then AJ Cortez walked in. He didn't dress for mourning. He wore the same hoodie and sneakers he wore everywhere. Logo splashed across his chest phone, already in hand. His entourage followed, carrying tripods and cameras, whispering about lighting. They looked out of place in a room of quiet reflection, but AJ didn't care. He scanned the crowd with a grin, as if daring anyone to stop him. Whispers spread across the hall, some in recognition, others in disbelief. The program moved on as if nothing had happened. A senior student of Master Lee spoke about humility and the way Lee had emphasized patience over pride. His voice carried emotion breaking at times. The crowd listened in silence. AJ, however, leaned against the wall, shaking his head, his phone held high as he streamed to his audience. He muttered into the camera, calling the speech a bedtime story for dinosaurs. His followers flooded the chat with laughing emojis. When the time came for open tributes, attendees expected a few more students to step forward. Instead, AJ moved fast. He slipped through the aisle, phone in hand, and walked onto the stage before anyone realized what he was doing. He stood where Master Lee's portrait had been set and turned the camera on himself. The room froze. The organizers whispered frantically, but no one had yet found the courage to stop him. AJ raised his free hand and shouted loud enough for the microphone to catch. He told his viewers he was standing at the altar of tradition in the shadow of the past. Then he leaned into the mic and laughed. He said, if Chuck Norris wants to be remembered as more than a ghost, he should stop hiding and meet me right here, right now. His voice echoed across the hall, cutting through the silence like a blade. Gasps followed. Some of the older guests rose to their feet, shaking their heads, their faces pale with anger. A veteran walked out, muttering that the boy had no shame. A group of students sat stiffly in their seats, confused between loyalty to tradition and fascination with AJ's boldness. The younger fans, many of whom had followed AJ online, erupted in cheers. They held up their own phones, filming him chanting his name. The atmosphere split clean in two. AJ thrived on it. He paced across the stage like it was his arena. He spoke of old legends clinging to respect because they couldn't survive in a cage today. He mocked the idea of bowing, calling it theater. He demanded Chuck Norris step forward, saying the world deserved to see if the man was real, or just a story. Every line was meant to sting. Every line was bait. His feed was blowing up viewers climbing by the hundreds. To him, this was the fight already won. The organizers tried to step in. One approached him, whispering that this was not the time or place. AJ brushed him off with a grin, telling the camera that even the event managers wanted to silence him because they knew he was right. He leaned back into the mic, raised his voice, and said, legends are only legends until someone new stands up. Then they're just names in a program. He pointed at Master Lee's portrait as if it were proof of his words. The crowd shuddered. The tension in the room was unbearable. Some left in silence, refusing to give him their eyes. Others stayed their hands, clenched their jaws tight. The veterans who had served alongside Lee's students glared but didn't move. They knew better than to dignify arrogance with action. The younger attendees, though, roared with excitement. They loved the drama. They lived for the chaos. They believed they were watching the future take the microphone away from the past. AJ closed his challenge with a smirk, tilting the camera close. He said he would be waiting. He said, if Chuck had the courage, he knew where to find him. Then he walked off the stage like he had just won a belt. His crew followed, grinning, already uploading clips to every platform. The candle at the front flickered as the door shut behind him, the silence in the room heavier than before. The memorial was broken. The air of reverence had been replaced by a mixture of anger, disappointment, and shame. Some bowed before the portrait and left refusing to stay in the wreckage of what was supposed to be sacred. Others sat in stunned quiet, not knowing how to recover from the moment. A few whispered prayers under their breath. The veterans lowered their heads, unwilling to let disrespect erase the man they came to honor. For AJ, it had been perfect. He had turned a memorial into a stage respect, into ratings. He didn't see the damage left behind. He didn't feel the weight of the silence that followed him. To him, it was all noise, and noise was power. But what he didn't realize was that somewhere in the back of that hall, someone had been listening. Someone who had no need for microphones or cameras. Someone who had lived long enough to know the difference between noise and truth. AJ had called out Chuck Norris, and Chuck had heard every word. Chuck Norris had been in the hall the entire time. He had slipped in quietly, before the program began taking a seat near the back, his presence unnoticed by most. Dressed simply, with a cap pulled low, he looked more like a veteran paying respects than the man who had once dominated tournaments and movie screens. He sat in silence as students spoke of Master Lee's wisdom, nodding at stories he had heard long ago. When AJ took the stage, Chuck did not stir. He did not frown. He did not shift in his chair. He simply watched. The challenge cut through the hall like a blade, words flung toward the air, as if they were arrows meant to strike down the past. The crowd bristled, but Chuck's face remained calm. He had known men like this before. Loud, eager, certain that noise equaled strength. He had fought them in tournaments and sparring halls in life. Some learned, some did not. Chuck sat with his hands folded, his gaze steady on the portrait of Master Lee rather than the young man mocking it. His silence carried weight. Those who noticed it felt it more deeply than AJ's shouts. Luther DeWitt noticed. The journalist had been covering martial arts for decades, long enough to know when something was shifting beneath the surface. He sat a few rows over notebook in hand, eyes flicking from AJ's performance to Chuck's stillness. Where others saw weakness, Luther sensed a storm building. Chuck wasn't avoiding the fight. He was letting it come to him. The restraint spoke louder than any answer could. When AJ's entourage left in a burst of laughter and cameras, Chuck rose quietly. No speech, no rebuttal, no need to explain. He walked down the side aisle, passing rows of veterans and students who lowered their heads as he went by. He stopped only once, standing before the portrait of Master Lee. He bowed, held the bow a second longer than most, then turned and left through the back door. The candle still flickered, the silence still heavy. Outside, the desert sun beat down on Prescott, and Chuck walked without hurry. He had no cameras trailing him, no live feed capturing his exit. To the world, it would seem like he hadn't been there at all. But Luther followed him with his eyes until he disappeared. He wrote a single note in his pad. He's waiting. It wasn't the weakness he had seen. It was patience. It was the calm before something inevitable. The next morning, headlines told a different story. Blogs and sports sites ran with AJ's clips, framing Chuck's silence as surrender. One article said that the old lion had lost his roar. Another claimed the legend had dodged the challenge, unwilling to face the new era. Younger fans celebrated, convinced they had watched history pass from one man to another. To them, silence was defeat. To them, presence without performance meant nothing. But among the older generation, whispers spread. Those who had been in the hall, those who had seen Chuck stand before the portrait, felt something different. They spoke quietly in forums and phone calls about the way he had bowed, about the way he had left without anger. They remembered that Chuck had never needed to shout to prove himself. His history was already written in victories, in discipline, in the lives he had touched. His silence wasn't a weakness. It was a choice. Luther DeWitt understood this better than most. He had seen fighters burn out chasing headlines. He had seen legends fade because they tried to keep up with noise instead of holding on to truth. Chuck's silence told him that this wasn't over. He could see it in the way Chuck's shoulders moved as he left the hall steady and unbroken. It was the same walk he had seen years ago, after a tournament in Houston, when Chuck had walked away from a heckler without a word, only to answer later in the ring with precision that silenced everyone. The media spun stories. AJ gained followers. Clips of his outburst were replayed endlessly, racking up millions of views. Fans argued online, debating whether Chuck had lost his edge or was simply ignoring the provocation. Luther stayed quiet, watching, waiting. He had been in the room. He had seen the look in Chuck's eyes. He knew better than to mistake stillness for surrender. That night, as AJ posted another video mocking the silence, Luther drafted an article. He didn't publish it. He only wrote the opening line. Sometimes silence is not retreat. Sometimes it is the breath before a strike. He closed his notebook, sat back, and waited. He knew the story wasn't AJ's yet. It belonged to the man who had said nothing, done nothing, but somehow left the entire hall holding its breath. Chuck Norris had walked away without a word. But in that silence, a challenge deeper than AJ could imagine had already been answered. The envelope showed up with no fanfare, no courier, no camera, no sponsor's logo. Just a plain, white envelope slipped under the door of AJ Cortez's rented suite at the Prescott Conference Center. His team found it first and tossed it onto the table, thinking it was another autograph request or a promotional offer. But when AJ picked it up, he noticed the weight of the paper and the sharp strokes of the handwriting across the front. His name, nothing else. He tore it open with a smirk, ready for another fan letter to mock on stream. Instead, he found a single sheet of paper folded once. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and the ink pressed hard enough to mark the fibers. It read, Dojo 17, Sunday 6 a.m. No cameras. CN. That was it. No threats, no explanations, no hashtags. Just the name, like a signature that carried more weight than any title belt. AJ laughed, holding the paper up to the light. He told his team it had to be a stunt, maybe part of the conference marketing. Maybe Chuck had finally agreed to play along and wanted to film something dramatic in a dusty old gym. His friends chuckled and threw out ideas for how to stream it. AJ's phone was already recording as he waved the letter at his followers, calling it the first official invitation from the ghost of martial arts past. The comments exploded, demanding he accept. AJ winked, promising he wouldn't miss it. Luther DeWitt heard about the note later that evening. A younger reporter showed it to him on a phone, laughing at how AJ's fans were treating it like a movie trailer. But Luther didn't laugh. His face went still, his eyes narrowed, and for a long moment, he said nothing. He knew the name Dojo 17. He had heard whispers about it decades ago. A private space. A place Chuck had built after Master Lee passed away. It was not open to the public. It was not advertised. It wasn't for sparring matches or staged performances. It was a shrine. Word spread quickly online. AJ's challenge was no longer just noise. Now there was a place and a time, and the internet feasted on it. Fans argued whether Chuck would actually show. Some claimed it was fake, that Chuck wouldn't bother. Others insisted it was the moment the old guard would finally crumble. Hashtags multiplied, debates raged, and AJ stoked the fire by posting training clips laced with jokes about alarm clocks and retirement homes. He treated the note as a gimmick content to feed his audience. But among the older martial artists, the reaction was different. Dojo 17 carried a weight they understood. It was not just a building. It was sacred ground built on the memory of a teacher whose lessons were bigger than fighting. Some of them had been invited there once, years ago, for a quiet ceremony. They knew what it meant for Chuck to write that note. It was not a fight invitation. It was a summons, a call to step into a place where noise had no power. Sunday at 6 a.m. carried its own symbolism. That was when Master Lee had always trained. When the world was still, when the body and mind were sharp, when the lessons of patience and discipline cut deepest. Chuck had chosen the hour not for convenience, but for meaning. To those who recognized it, the note was a statement. To AJ and his fans, it was just another headline. Luther sat in his hotel room that night, staring at a blank page. He thought about writing the story early, breaking it before anyone else. But he closed his notebook instead. Some stories he knew were too fragile to cheapen with speculation. This was one of them. He had covered fights in crowded arenas, press conferences with flashing lights, and contracts worth millions. None of them carried the weight of a single sheet of paper with a time and place. The air around Prescott seemed to shift as Sunday crept closer. Whispers grew. Older guests at the conference spoke in low voices about what it could mean. Younger fans camped outside gyms, hoping to catch a glimpse of AJ's training sessions. Commentators argued on late-night shows about whether Chuck was walking into a trap or staging his own farewell. But Chuck himself said nothing. He made no statements, gave no interviews, offered no hint of what was coming. The silence only deepened the mystery. AJ strutted in the spotlight, but even he felt a flicker of something he couldn't name when he looked at the letter. He laughed about it on camera, but when the lights were off, he read it again. The words were too plain, too direct to be a stunt. For the first time, he wondered if maybe this wasn't about content at all. He shook the thought away and told himself it would be easy. Just another stage, another show. But the letter stayed in his pocket, folded tight, pressing against him like a weight. Luther watched from a distance, notebook closed, mind racing. He had been in the room when AJ mocked Master Lee's memory. He had seen Chuck's silence, and now he had seen the note. To him, the line was clear. This wasn't about proving who could fight harder. It was about something older, deeper, something most of the world had forgotten. Luther knew he would be there on Sunday, not as a reporter chasing a headline, but as a witness to whatever truth unfolded. Dojo 17 was waiting. And in the quiet space between laughter and silence, the air grew heavier with every passing hour. The sun had barely lifted over the ridges when AJ Cortez pulled up outside Dojo 17. The building looked nothing like what he had expected. No banners, no cameras, no signs announcing a fight of the century. Just a modest wooden structure tucked between desert scrub and the shadows of old pines. His crew set up their equipment, whispering about angles and lighting, but the place seemed to swallow their voices. The air felt different here. AJ pushed through the sliding door with swagger, phone in hand, grin, ready for the lens. But the moment he stepped inside, the grin faltered. The dojo was stripped bare, no flashing screens, no rows of bleachers, just polished wooden floors, the faint scent of cedar, and a single portrait of Master Lee hanging at the front. Beneath it, Chuck Norris knelt, dressed in a plain, white uniform, lighting a stick of incense. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritual. He didn't look up when AJ entered. The crew hesitated, unsure whether to film. Their lenses caught the rising curl of smoke, the bowed head of a man who looked more like a student paying respect than a legend preparing for combat. Chuck placed the incense gently into a holder and bowed, once holding the bow, as if the silence itself demanded patience. AJ shifted uneasily, phone still raised, but the words he had prepared didn't come out. For the first time in his career, the stage didn't belong to him. Chuck rose to his feet without a sound. He didn't greet AJ. He didn't acknowledge the cameras. He simply stepped to the center of the mat, rolled his shoulders, and began to stretch. His breath was deep and steady, his movements flowing with the ease of a man who had repeated them thousands of times. There was no rush, no tension, no performance. Each motion carried weight, as if tied to something invisible but unshakable. The film crew exchanged nervous glances. The red lights on their cameras blinked, But even through the lens, they could feel the strangeness of the scene. This wasn't entertainment. It wasn't content. It was something sacred, something older than social media and viral clips. AJ felt it too, though he didn't want to admit it. The dojo seemed to press against him, stripping away the armor of sarcasm and bravado he usually wore with ease. He tried to laugh, muttering about old men stretching, but the words sounded hollow in the vast stillness. Chuck didn't flinch. He bent low arms, extended, pausing in each stance, as if listening to the silence itself. The incense smoke curled upward, carrying the faint aroma of sandalwood, and AJ found himself distracted by it. His heart beat harder than it should have. He told himself it was the anticipation of a fight, but deep down, he knew it was something else. This was not what he had prepared for. He had trained for a clash of fists, for a spectacle he could capture and spin into content. He had imagined Chuck bursting in with a fiery speech, maybe a challenge shouted in front of cameras. Instead, he stood in the presence of a man who had nothing to prove. A man who answered mockery with stillness and turned confrontation into a ritual. The silence was heavier than any crowd's roar. The crew slowly lowered their cameras. One by one, the little red lights clicked off, as if even technology knew it didn't belong here. No one told them to stop. They just knew. AJ looked around, searching for something familiar, something he could control, but the room gave him nothing. It was bare. It was honest. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw the reflection of his own noise crashing against a wall of silence. Chuck continued moving. A step, a breath, a stretch that flowed into another. His face was calm, his eyes half closed, and his body rooted as if every motion was a prayer. He had not spoken a single word since AJ entered, but the message was clear. This wasn't about clicks or views. It wasn't even about a fight. It was about something larger, something AJ had spent his career mocking without ever understanding. AJ lowered his phone. His crew watched him, waiting for a signal, but he didn't give one. The swagger was gone from his shoulders. He tried to stand tall, but the dojo seemed to shrink him with its stillness. Chuck hadn't challenged him. He hadn't welcomed him. He had simply begun to move, as if AJ's presence didn't change the rhythm of his practice at all. That was the most unsettling part. AJ wasn't in control anymore. The minutes stretched on heavy and quiet. AJ shifted on his feet, waiting for Chuck to turn, acknowledge him, and give him something to work with. But the old fighter just kept moving, grounded in each breath, as if the young man before him didn't exist. At that moment, AJ began to feel something unfamiliar. Not anger, not excitement. Something smaller. Something he had spent years running from. Humility. Dojo 17 had opened its doors, and with every silent movement, Chuck Norris was teaching a lesson without speaking a word. AJ couldn't stand the silence any longer. His chest rose and fell faster than it should have, not from exertion, but from the weight of the stillness pressing down on him. He stepped forward, bouncing lightly on his toes, hands raised, eyes fixed on the older man. Chuck Norris had finished stretching, and now stood at the center of the mat. His posture relaxed, his arms at his sides. He looked as though he had all the time in the world. That calmness infuriated AJ. AJ snapped into motion. A quick jab, sharp and fast, meant to catch Chuck off guard. The strike cut through the air, but Chuck shifted his weight just enough that the punch missed. He didn't counter. He didn't flinch. He simply moved aside, smooth as water, sliding around a stone. AJ smirked, brushing it off, and fired another combination, faster this time. 2 jabs across, then a hook. Each one missed by inches. Chuck's body seemed to know where the strikes were going before AJ did. Frustration rippled through AJ. He threw a low kick, hoping to clip Chuck's legs, but again, the man shifted, barely lifting his foot in a subtle step that left AJ swinging at air. Then, before AJ could reset, Chuck lifted a hand and tapped AJ lightly on the shoulder. Just a touch. No force behind it. Then he stepped back. The touch was so small, it shouldn't have mattered, but it landed heavier than a strike. AJ blinked, thrown off balance, not by impact, but by what it meant. Chuck could have hit him. He could have countered, could have punished the openings AJ had left. Instead, he chose not to. He chose a simple tap, as if to remind him that every attack was already seen, already understood. The silence that followed made the moment feel louder than any crowd's roar. AJ clenched his jaw and reset. He told himself it was a fluke. He launched again, faster, harder, his fists snapping through combinations that had dropped opponents before. Chuck moved with the same quiet precision. He tilted, shifted, leaned just enough to let each strike slip by. Another light tap, this time on AJ's elbow. Then he stepped back again. AJ's eyes narrowed. His breath came quicker. His confidence wavered. The crew standing by the walls didn't speak. Their cameras captured everything, but no one dared interrupt. They had expected fireworks fists colliding the kind of content that made headlines. What they were seeing was slower, quieter, but far more powerful. Every missed strike, every gentle touch told a story they couldn't edit out. The young star looked frantic. The old master looked untouched. AJ tried to laugh it off. He muttered about tricks about the old man dodging instead of fighting, but the words didn't carry the weight they usually did. He lunged again, throwing a spinning back fist, then a knee, then another wild hook. Each time Chuck stepped away inches ahead, his breathing steady, his face calm. Another tap. This time, it was on AJ's chest, right over his heart. A reminder. Not a strike, a truth. The touch rattled AJ more than any blow could have. His body tensed. His arms felt heavier. He realized that for all his speed, for all his power, he wasn't in control. Chuck was. Chuck dictated the rhythm, the distance, the meaning of every exchange. AJ was fighting noise. Chuck was answering with silence, and silence was winning. Minutes passed like this, and each exchange was the same. AJ attacking Chuck, evading a gentle touch, then stillness. The pattern grew unbearable. AJ felt like he was being toyed with, yet the look on Chuck's face held no mockery, no arrogance, just patience. Each movement was precise, and each breath was measured. He wasn't trying to humiliate. He was teaching. And the lesson was cutting deeper than any punch. By the fifth tap, AJ's strikes had lost some of their snap. His arms were still fast, his body still sharp, but doubt had slipped in. He hated the feeling. He wasn't used to being doubted. He was used to dominance, to crowds cheering every knockout, to opponents who broke under pressure. But here in this quiet dojo, with no audience, every ounce of his bravado seemed to evaporate. Chuck stepped back again, feet planted firmly, eyes steady. He still hadn't spoken. Not a word. His silence was more commanding than any shout could have been. AJ stood across from him, chest heaving, sweat beginning to gather at his temples. For the first time in years, he felt like the younger man in the room. Not the star, not the content creator, just a student facing something he didn't yet understand. The incense still burned at the front of the dojo, the faint smoke curling toward the rafters. It filled the air with the same quiet presence as Chuck's movements. AJ looked at the portrait of Master Lee, then back at the man standing before him. The reality pressed in. This wasn't content. This wasn't a fight he could spin into a clip. This was something older, deeper. Something he wasn't ready for. Chuck shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself with a breath. He raised his hands, not in defense, not in aggression, but as if opening the floor for AJ to try again. His expression hadn't changed. Calm, focused, patient. AJ's heart pounded in his chest, not from exhaustion, but from the realization settling in. The first touch hadn't been a strike. It had been a warning. And for the first time, AJ wondered if he was the one being tested. AJ's breath came in short bursts now. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his glove and reset his stance, eyes locked on the man across from him. Chuck Norris had barely moved from the center of the mat. His feet were planted, his body upright, his eyes steady. It looked less like a fight, and more like he was standing guard over something unseen. That calmness burned inside AJ like an insult. He exploded forward fists, snapping in combinations that had dropped trained fighters in seconds. A jab, a hook and elbow, then a knee. Each one missed by inches. Chuck shifted only enough to avoid them. His body seemed to know the exact distance of every strike before AJ even threw it. He didn't retreat. He didn't advance. He just existed in the perfect space between motion and stillness, never giving more than was needed. AJ snarled under his breath, adding power to his swings. His fists cut through the air, harder, sharper, wilder. Chuck raised a hand, blocking with a light parry that barely touched AJ's wrist. Another attack. Another subtle redirection. A kick aimed at Chuck's ribs stopped short when Chuck stepped in and tapped AJ's shoulder with 2 fingers. It wasn't forced. It was placement. Every time AJ felt it, like a brand, the frustration mounted. AJ's speed doubled his attacks, chaining together in frantic rhythm. The sound of his strikes echoed against the wooden walls, sharp and angry. But Chuck never flinched. He leaned, turned, shifted each movement precise and small. His breathing stayed steady, as if none of it cost him effort. AJ was the storm. Chuck was the eye at its center, untouched. AJ shouted, trying to drown the silence. His words mixed with the sound of fists cutting air. He told himself he was winning, that the old man was afraid to hit back. But in his chest, doubt grew. His arms ached from swinging. His lungs burned. And still, every attack ended the same way. A missed strike. A gentle touch. A silence that mocked him without a word. The dojo felt heavier with each passing second. The incense smoke curled above them, filling the air with a stillness that AJ couldn't break, no matter how hard he tried. His crew had stopped filming. They stood frozen, their lenses lowered, eyes locked on the 2 men in the center of the room. This wasn't content anymore. It was something raw, something older than the technology in their hands. Then it happened. In the middle of AJ's flurry, Chuck blocked a punch with the lightest brush of his forearm and stepped in close. His hand landed on AJ's chest, holding him in place without force. His eyes met AJ's, calm and steady. And in a voice so quiet, it seemed to rise from the floor itself. Chuck spoke. "You talk a lot. You're just not seeing it." The words cut deeper than any strike. AJ froze, his arm still raised, and his breath stuck in his throat. The sentence was simple, but it hit with the weight of truth he didn't want to face. He realized in that instant that Chuck had seen through everything. Every move, every mask, every piece of noise he had built around himself. The dojo fell even quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. AJ staggered back, lowering his arms. His chest heaved as the meaning sank in. He thought he was the one testing Chuck. He thought this was about speed, strength, and dominance. But the lesson was different. It wasn't about hitting harder. It was about seeing and understanding what was in front of him, beyond the noise and the flash. Chuck had been teaching with silence, and AJ hadn't recognized it until now. He wanted to lash out again to prove the words wrong, but his body hesitated. His strikes had been fast. His combinations are flawless. Yet every movement had been empty in comparison to the man standing before him. AJ realized his frustration wasn't with Chuck. It was with himself. He had built a career on noise, but in this place, against this man, noise had no power. Chuck stepped back, lowering his hand, returning to stillness. His breathing remained calm, his stance unbroken. He didn't press the moment. He didn't gloat. He let the silence return, leaving AJ alone with the words echoing in his head. You're just not seeing it. The dojo seemed to expand in that silence. The portrait of Master Lee at the front of the room looked down with unblinking eyes. The incense smoke drifted like a reminder of something unseen but present. AJ's chest rose and fell, sweat dripping down his face, the weight of the lesson pressing harder than any blow he had ever taken. He had come for content. He had come to mock, to film, to conquer. But now, in the sacred quiet of Dojo 17, he felt something shift. He couldn't name it yet. He only knew that the first crack had formed in the armor of his arrogance. And it wasn't because of pain or defeat. It was because of stillness. Chuck Norris had spoken only a handful of words, yet they echoed louder than AJ's entire career of shouting. AJ lunged forward one more time, body tight with frustration, fists flying on instinct. The movements were clean, powerful, and practiced, but they carried something off something that had nothing to do with form or speed. He wasn't aiming at a man anymore. He was aiming at the silence, at the stillness. In the reflection, he couldn't seem to shake loose. Chuck didn't block. He didn't need to. He shifted his weight just slightly, and AJ overreached. His foot slid on the mat, his balance off by just enough. The air felt too quiet to catch him. In one clumsy moment, all his control collapsed beneath him. His knees hit the wood first, then his palms, then the side of his face. The thud wasn't loud, but it echoed in AJ's ears. He stayed down, stunned, breathing hard, forehead pressed against the warm wood. The silence stretched thick and alive, like the dojo itself had something to say. Sweat ran down the side of his nose. His heart pounded, not from the fall, but from something deeper, something breaking. Chuck stepped into view, his shadow falling over AJ's back. He didn't reach down to help. He didn't laugh. He stood still, then spoke so softly it barely stirred the air. The floor always reflects who we are. The words hit harder than the fall. AJ blinked, his eyes focused on the grain of the wood beneath him. The floor didn't just hold his reflection. It held a moment, the truth of it. All his speed, all his noise, all his effort, it had brought him here, on his knees, in silence, in front of a man who had never needed to strike. The floor was smooth, but worn each line in the wood, shaped by years of quiet practice. AJ saw his own face in the sheen of it, not the one his followers saw online, but something more raw. He saw the tightness around his eyes, the confusion, the bruised ego. This wasn't about technique anymore. This wasn't even about Chuck. It was about him. About the way he had entered this space, about the need to be seen, heard, and admired. Every move he'd made had been louder than the last desperate to claim space. And now, here he was, in the quietest place he'd ever known, unable to hide behind speed or jokes. He sat back, slow hands on his knees, chest still heaving. He didn't look up right away. He stayed with the floor, as if it held more answers than he could find in the air above. His breath slowed, not because he chose to calm down, but because the silence left him no other choice. Chuck had stepped back again, giving him room. He didn't offer advice or criticism. He simply waited, grounded in something deeper than pride or power. AJ could feel it now, like a pulse underneath the wood, the rhythm of restraint, of time, of lessons earned in years, not clips. AJ looked up finally, not out of challenge, but because he didn't want to stay down. Not like that. Not anymore. He met Chuck's gaze, and for the first time, he didn't see an opponent. He saw a mirror, one that didn't lie, one that didn't care about followers or fast hands. Everything about this moment told him something had to change. But the change wouldn't come with a knockout. It wouldn't come with a win. It would have to come quietly. The way Chuck had moved, the way he had spoken, the way he had stood over him without needing to say more. The floor had shown him everything he needed to see. And for the first time, AJ didn't look away. AJ sat on the floor of the dojo, long after the last exchange. His arms rested loosely on his knees, eyes locked on the spot where Chuck had been standing moments ago. The sweat on his skin had dried to salt. His breath had slowed, but his thoughts hadn't. He felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It wasn't a defeat. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, something harder to name. His crew stood by the door, uncertain, silent. None of them dared say what they were thinking. Their cameras were still their screens blank. No one was filming anymore. The story had taken a turn they didn't understand, and AJ could feel it too. The usual adrenaline after a fight was gone. In its place was an ache that had nothing to do with muscles or bruises. Chuck moved slowly, tying his GI top back into place. His steps made no sound on the wooden floor. He didn't look at AJ, didn't say anything, just gathered what little he had brought and made his way toward the exit. He hadn't struck a single blow. He hadn't raised his voice. And yet AJ felt like he had been cracked open from the inside. The weight of it all caught AJ off guard. He looked down again at the floor, still remembering how it felt beneath his cheek, how it had mirrored something he didn't want to see. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. The dojo stayed quiet, like it was holding its breath with him. Finally, just before Chuck reached the door, AJ forced the words out. "Why did you even show up?" The question came out low, uneven. It surprised him more than anyone else. It hadn't been rehearsed. It hadn't been planned. It had come from somewhere deeper, somewhere raw. Chuck paused. He didn't turn around. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked over his shoulder, eyes calm, voice steady. "Because you asked." The answer landed like a stone in still water. AJ blinked, unsure he heard right. He waited, hoping for more. Chuck turned fully now, facing him. "Not with your words, with your ignorance." There was no anger in his voice, no superiority, just truth, quiet and heavy. AJ couldn't move. The sentence hung in the air, unshakable. It filled the room more than any crowd ever had. His hands tightened slightly on his knees. He felt a pulse of heat rise in his face, but it wasn't rage. It was a shame. A deep, sudden realization that Chuck had come not to defend himself, but to teach him. Not because of a challenge, but because of a need AJ hadn't even seen in himself. The silence after was unbearable. Chuck didn't fill it. He didn't offer comfort. He simply bowed toward the portrait of Master Lee and began walking again. His steps are slow and deliberate. AJ didn't stop him this time. He had no more clever lines, no camera tricks. He just sat there, a student who hadn't realized he'd been in class all along. The door closed behind Chuck with a soft thud. AJ looked at his crew, but they didn't look back. Some of them stared at the floor. Others stared at him. But no one said a word. They didn't have to. They had seen what he saw. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, head bowed. He replayed Chuck's words again in his mind, because you asked. Not with your words, with your ignorance. AJ had spent his whole life shouting. Yet the only thing that brought Chuck Norris into his life was something unspoken, something hidden beneath all the noise. And now, for the first time, AJ had no idea what to say. AJ stayed in the dojo long after Chuck was gone. The quiet felt different now. It wasn't just empty. It was full of something he couldn't name, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He sat there, with his hands in his lap, staring at the place where the incense had burned down to ash. The smell still lingered. It reminded him of a different room, a different mat from a long time ago. He was 13, the first time he bowed on a mat. The dojo was small and tucked between a laundromat and a bike shop in a tired strip mall. His mom had signed him up because he wouldn't stop fighting at school. She was worn thin, working 2 jobs, and hoped the place would burn off some of his anger. The teacher was an old man named Mr. Saito, who moved like his joints were made of smoke. Classes were slow. They started with stillness, not drills. They practiced breathing, bowing, listening. AJ hated it. He wanted to punch something. He wanted action noise sweat. But Mr. Saito would shake his head and say, "The body moves where the mind leads." AJ didn't understand. He thought the man was just old and out of touch. He remembered one afternoon clearly. AJ had just stormed off the mat after being corrected again. He was furious and embarrassed in front of the other students. He started to grab his bag when Mr. Saito called him over. He handed AJ a small cloth-wrapped book. The pages were yellowed and stiff. The cover was marked only by a single word, Bushido. Mr. Saito didn't scold him. He didn't give a lecture. He just said, "You don't fight people, you fight your ego." Then he bowed and turned away. AJ never opened the book. He left it in his closet, buried under old shoes and forgotten medals. 2 weeks later, he quit the dojo. AJ's next school had music mirrors and a logo on every wall. It was faster, louder, and more exciting. He learned how to win matches, how to throw sharp kicks that looked good on camera. By 16, he had a growing online following. By 20, he was undefeated in regional circuits. The anger that once got him into trouble now kept him in the spotlight. He told himself he didn't need the slow stuff. He didn't need old sayings or incense or books with no pictures. He needed results. And he got them. But now, sitting alone in a quiet dojo with his own sweat drying on his skin, AJ felt that old book pressing into his memory like a bruise. He saw Mr. Saito's face again. Calm, never demanding. Always patient. AJ remembered the way he'd bow even when no one was looking. The way he moved with purpose, not for show. And now, after all these years, after all the wins and noise, those words came back louder than any cheer he'd ever gotten. You don't fight people. You fight your ego. AJ leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His hands hung loose between his legs. He wondered what Mr. Saito would think if he saw him now. Would he nod and say the lesson had just taken longer to land? Or would he say nothing at all, knowing AJ had to feel it himself? He wished he still had that book, not to post about it, not to look wise, just to hold it, to see what was inside, to find the words he had once ignored. The regret sat deep in his chest, not because he had chosen a different path, but because he hadn't even understood what he was walking away from. At the time, it felt like moving forward. Now, it felt like something lost. AJ looked around the dojo again. The floor was clean. The portrait of Master Lee still watched from the front wall. Everything was quiet, waiting. And for once, AJ didn't want to fill the silence. He wanted to sit in it a little longer. Maybe there was still something left to learn. The studio was small, tucked behind a quiet cafe in downtown Prescott. Just 2 chairs, a single camera, and a pot of black coffee cooling between them. Luther DeWitt had requested the interview quietly, without press, without fanfare. Chuck had agreed on the condition that it would be one conversation. No edits, no spin. Just words, if they came. The 2 men sat across from each other, years of experience between them. Luther leaned forward, notebook unopened in his lap. He wasn't there to dig. He was there to listen. Chuck sat with his hands folded, posture relaxed. His face looked older under the lights, but not tired. Worn in the way a good pair of gloves fits just right. Luther started slowly. He asked about the dojo, about Master Lee, about the old days. Chuck answered in short phrases, never too much, never too little. His voice was low steady, with a slight rasp that only made it feel more grounded. There was no talk of AJ, no need to explain what everyone had already seen. Chuck didn't dwell on the event. He spoke about the discipline behind it. He said training wasn't about becoming stronger than someone else. It was about becoming less reactive, more aware. He said pain was a great teacher, but stillness taught you more if you could stand it. The conversation drifted from martial arts to life. Chuck talked about mistakes he'd made, people he'd lost, and the ways silence had saved him. At one point, Luther asked what victory meant to him now. Chuck paused for a long moment before answering. Then he said, "True victory isn't defeating others. It's mastering yourself." That sentence landed like a bell in a church no one remembered existed. Luther wrote it down without lifting his head. The camera caught the line without needing a second take. Chuck didn't repeat it. He didn't smile. He just let it hang quiet and whole. The interview was posted 3 days later. No hashtags, no clips, just a single link with the title, "A Conversation with Chuck Norris." It didn't trend right away. It didn't flood timelines or make headlines, but it moved. It moved through old forums where veterans traded thoughts in silence. It moved through email threads between teachers and former students. It passed from one practitioner to another, like a folded note that couldn't be printed on a shirt. No music, no edits, just words wrapped in humility. That one quote, "True victory isn't defeating others. It's mastering yourself," found its way into dojos, locker rooms, church basements, and back porches. It showed up taped to mirrors. It made its way into sermons and lectures. Nobody screamed it. Nobody branded it. They just shared it. Luther watched the ripple unfold. He got messages from strangers in small towns. One from a retired police officer. Another from a woman who had taught Tai Chi in a senior center for 20 years. Each message said the same thing in different words. "Thank you for letting him speak." Chuck never commented on the interview again. He didn't post about it, didn't reference it in later appearances, but the impact lived quietly, like roots growing under the surface of something long buried. Not loud, but alive. And somewhere in the background, in places where silence still mattered, that message kept moving. Not as a slogan, as a reminder. The building looked smaller than he remembered. The faded sign above the door still read, Saito Martial Arts, though the paint had long since peeled. AJ stepped out of his car, slowly, hands in his pockets, unsure of what he was even hoping to find. The sidewalk leading up to the entrance was cracked and overgrown with weeds. The windows were dusty, but sunlight still reached through them, like memory, refusing to fade. He pushed open the door. The familiar chime above it rang soft and tired. Inside, the air held the same faint smell. He'd forgotten sweat wood polish and old incense. The mats were worn-patched in places with tape. The room was quiet. It felt untouched, like time had stopped, waiting for someone to come home. A woman in her 60s peered from behind the desk. She didn't ask his name. She didn't need to. Her eyes softened, and she gave a nod that said more than words could. She told him the master had passed 2 years ago, quietly, in his sleep. He'd kept the dojo open until the end, even when students stopped coming. AJ stood there, unsure of what to say. The woman didn't press. She walked into a back room and returned with a small envelope, yellowed and soft at the corners. She handed it to him and said he wrote this for you. Never sent it. Thought maybe one day you'd come back. He took the letter with both hands. His throat tightened. The envelope had his name on it. Just AJ, written in careful brush strokes. He sat down on the edge of the old mat, right near the corner where he used to line up with the other kids. The letter felt warm in his hand, even though the room was cool. He opened it slowly. The paper inside crackled like it had been waiting too long. The handwriting was neat, a little shaky. The letter began by saying how proud the master had been of AJ's talent. He remembered his fire, his energy. Then he said something that caught in AJ's chest like a stone. He said he had always known AJ would leave because he was chasing something bigger. But he hoped someday, when that chase grew quiet, AJ would find his way back to the mat. He wrote that true strength wasn't in the body. It was on returning, in learning what you missed the first time, in bowing again, with open hands. The letter ended with one line that AJ read twice before folding the page. The door will always be open if your heart ever is. AJ didn't cry, but he came close. He set the letter down beside him and looked across the dojo. He saw himself in every corner. The boy who had rolled his eyes at slow movements. The teenager who wanted louder lessons. He saw the space where Mr. Saito used to sit, hands on his knees, waiting for the class to settle. He remembered the feeling of that silence. Back then, it annoyed him. Now, it felt like home. He took off his shoes, stepped barefoot onto the mat, walked to the center, and sat cross-legged. His hands rested lightly on his thighs. He closed his eyes, breathed in slowly. The room didn't need to speak. It had already said enough. And for the first time in years, AJ listened. AJ slipped through the back entrance of a community gym that smelled faintly of dust and old sweat. It was the kind of place where ceiling fans clicked more than they spun, and the floor mats didn't always match. No one greeted him. No one snapped a photo. He liked it that way. He arrived early before the regulars. He stretched in silence, kneeling on a corner mat with a faded red border. His movements were slow, almost hesitant. Not because his body was weak, because his mind was learning to listen. Each breath came with intention. Each motion traced a path he had once rushed through without really understanding. He worked on stances, deep-rooted stances that burned in his thighs after a few seconds. He held them longer than he thought he could, adjusted his posture, started over. There was no mirror, no music, no camera crew. Just the sound of his breath and the hum of the building settling around him. He moved into basic blocks, downward, inward, outward. He focused on the angle of his wrist, the position of his elbow, the silence in his steps. Every few minutes he would stop and reset. The routine wasn't glamorous. It didn't look like training. It looked like waiting. But something inside him was changing. He did this day after day. No announcements, no streams, just sweat and wood and air. He wore the same plain shirt every time. He taped his wrists by hand. He left his phone in the locker. The stillness became a rhythm, one he hadn't known he needed. One afternoon, a kid sat nearby, tying his belt, eyes fixed on AJ. The boy couldn't have been more than 10. He watched as AJ repeated the same low stance for the 5th time. The boy tilted his head, then asked, "Why is a famous fighter doing white belt stuff?" AJ didn't laugh. He stood slowly, wiped sweat from his forehead, and looked at the boy. His answer came without hesitation. "Because I never really learned it the first time." The boy stared for a moment longer, then nodded, as if that made perfect sense. AJ returned to the mat and resumed the stance. His legs trembled slightly from holding it, but he stayed. There was no pride in his body now, only presence. Each minute was earned. The gym filled up slowly with other students. Some recognized him, some whispered, but no one interrupted. AJ trained until the light shifted in the windows. Then he bowed to the mat, picked up his bag, and left. He came back the next day, and the next. What he used to chase with speed, he now approached with patience. What he used to flaunt, he now guarded quietly. And as the weeks passed, his movements changed. They looked simpler, but they felt more complete. In the silence, AJ found something he'd missed for years. Not applause, not validation, just the work, just the craft. And that, finally, was enough. The school gym smelled like rubber and floor wax. Folded chairs lined the edge of the mat. A few teachers stood off to the side with clipboards and polite smiles. Dozens of high school students, some in uniform, some in sneakers, sat cross-legged on the floor, half curious, half distracted. AJ stood at the center of the room, wearing a plain black t-shirt and old GI pants. No belt, no stage lights, just a microphone clipped to his collar and a quiet pause before he spoke. He looked out at the students, then down at his bare feet. The echo of the room reminded him of where he started. He didn't begin with a kata or a showy spin kick. He didn't talk about championship wins or viral clips. Instead, he told them the truth. He talked about how he used to treat martial arts like a stage, how he only cared about followers and noise, how he thought control meant speed, and victory meant being louder than your opponent. He paused as the room settled into quiet. Then he spoke about losing to silence, about the day he stood in a dojo with no crowd, no ref, and no strikes, about being broken down by stillness, about being forced to face the one opponent he had been running from his own ego. The students sat up a little straighter. Their fidgeting slowed. AJ didn't dramatize it. He just spoke simply. He said he had to start over, that he went back to the lowest stances, to the old lessons he once called boring, that he trained now for clarity, not attention. A hand went up in the front row. A girl in a white belt with her hair tied back asked the question gently. "How do you know you've changed?" AJ stood quietly for a second. Then he stepped closer and said it low, steady, like it came from a place deeper than memory. "Your real belt is not on your waist. It's in your decisions." The room went still. A few teachers nodded. One of the older students lowered his eyes like he'd just heard something that cut through him. AJ didn't need to say more. The moment was recorded by someone in the back. Just a grainy clip with muffled audio. No filters, no music. But that one line traveled. It showed up later on martial arts forums. It got passed around by coaches and senseis who rarely shared videos. It landed in inboxes with subject lines like, "This is worth 3 minutes." It didn't go viral. It went deeper than that. AJ finished the talk with a bow to the students. Not one of those stiff, polite bows for show. It was slow, full-bodied, and earned. He walked off the mat and thanked the organizers with both hands. As he packed his bag in a hallway, one of the students ran up to him. Not for a photo, just to shake his hand. And in that handshake, AJ felt something he hadn't touched in years. Respect, not for who he used to be, but for who he was becoming. AJ took a photo of the letter on a quiet Sunday morning. He didn't flatten it or clean the edges. The creases, the faded ink, and the gentle tilt of the handwriting, all of it, stayed exactly as it was. He placed it on the old mat where he had first read it and let the light catch it just enough to show the years it had carried. Then he posted the image online. No caption, no filter, just the paper, just the words. He didn't expect a reaction. He didn't want one. It wasn't about views anymore. It was about letting the letter speak for itself. By the end of the day, a few martial arts instructors had shared it on their pages. They didn't tag him. They didn't ask for credit. They just reposted it with a quiet sentence. "Read this. Give it to your kid." Within a week, the letter had found its way to community dojos in small towns and inner-city gyms. Teachers printed it out and taped it beside their attendance sheets. Some read it aloud before class. Others left it on benches where students would see it while tying their belts. It moved not by force, but by feeling. Veterans shared it in newsletters. A retired black belt in Pennsylvania mailed copies to his former students. A woman who had taught self-defense for 30 years posted it to her wall with a note. "This is why we bow." It didn't spike in numbers. It grew in presence, in coffee shop conversations between old training partners, in phone calls between fathers and sons, in text messages or sent at midnight from one former student to another. The signature at the bottom, Saito Sensei, became a name many had never known, but felt like they'd always heard. His words, quiet and sincere, crossed the generational divide that had grown in the sport. The gap between the flash of youth and the weight of tradition, between the chase for clicks and the long, slow path of mastery. AJ didn't repost any of it. He watched it move on its own, exactly as it should. One evening, he walked past a small neighborhood dojo. He saw the letter pinned to a bulletin board inside behind glass. A teenage boy was reading it while waiting for class to begin. AJ didn't go in. He just stood outside for a moment, hand resting on the window frame. The boy read the letter, then folded his hands and bowed toward the mat. AJ felt something settle in his chest, something that had once felt broken. The letter had done what it was meant to do. It had returned home. The message arrived without a subject line, just a quiet ping at the edge of the afternoon when the light in AJ's apartment was starting to fade and the hum of the outside world had gone soft. He saw the name and sat still for a moment. Then he tapped the screen. The video opened with no music or title, just Chuck standing alone in what looked like his home dojo. The walls were bare. The floor was clean. He wore a simple GI sleeves rolled at the forearms. His face looked rested. His eyes are steady. He looked straight into the lens. Then he spoke, clear and calm. Some paths you can only walk alone, but I'll be watching your footprints. That was it. 12 seconds. No more. The clip ended without a fade, without a signature. Just Chuck's image disappearing into stillness. AJ sat there, holding the phone as if it weighed more than it did. He played it again. Then once more. Each time the words settled deeper. Not like instruction, like acknowledgement, like a nod from across a great distance. He didn't share it. He didn't clip it, or quote it, or forward it to anyone. He saved it to a folder with no name. He placed the phone face down on the table and stared at the empty space in front of him. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't approval. It was something else. A quiet passing of weight. A confirmation that he was no longer being tested. Just watched. Trusted. For a long time, AJ didn't move. He listened to the silence around him. He thought about the path ahead. Not the spotlight, not the crowd, just the next step. And how to leave it clean. Then he stood, walked barefoot to the mat, and rolled out in his living room. He bowed slowly. Not to Chuck, not to the camera, to the floor beneath his feet, to the path, and the footprints he now knew someone would see. The gym was quiet when AJ arrived. No music, no crowds, just the squeak of shoes on old hardwood and the occasional thump of gloves on canvas. The tournament was small and local, the kind that gave out plastic trophies and folded chairs. He parked his car out back and walked in alone, a plain duffel over his shoulder, and no one was waiting to greet him. He wore a simple white gi with no patches, no brand, no sponsor, just a clean cloth and a black belt tied firmly. He didn't sign in with his full name, just his initials and weight class. The volunteers didn't recognize him. That was how he wanted it. As he stretched near the edge of the mat, he could hear the echo of someone warming up loudly a few feet away. Heavy breathing, sharp grunts, shoes slapping the floor in a way that wanted attention. He turned his head and saw him. The fighter was maybe 10 years younger, flashy haircut, branded gear. His team stood behind him with phones out, hyping him up. AJ watched for a moment. The man moved fast, hit hard, and smiled into the lens after every combo. He mocked a competitor who slipped on a warm-up kick, laughing loud enough to draw eyes. AJ didn't react. He just went back to breathing. When the brackets were posted, AJ read his name beside the young man's. The loud one, the one with the camera and the smirk. It figured. He didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel anything close to rage. What he felt was clarity. This wasn't about victory. This wasn't about proving he'd changed. It was about seeing where he truly stood inside himself. When the time came, they bowed on the mat. His opponent threw a wink to someone in the crowd. AJ kept his eyes low. They touched gloves. The ref gave the signal. The fight started fast. His opponent came in hard, trying to overwhelm him with speed. But AJ didn't meet force with force. He slipped. He shifted. He blocked with precision and answered with breath, not brute power. The crowd expected noise. They got rhythm. At one point, the young man growled a taunt under his breath. AJ didn't answer. He just moved. He stayed close to the floor. He watched the shoulders, not the hands. He waited. Then came the break, a moment when the opponent overcommitted on a spinning kick, losing his balance just slightly. AJ stepped in, placed his palm on the man's chest, and let him feel his own forward momentum collapse. The other fighter stumbled back, surprised. He charged again, more aggressive, now trying to turn the tide. AJ parried and stepped aside. No show, no hit, just enough. When the match ended, the scores were clear. AJ had won, but he didn't raise his fist. He bowed. The younger man looked stunned, confused. He muttered something under his breath about luck and walked off before the handshake. AJ didn't chase him. He collected his bag and left the mat the way he had come. Quiet. Still. A few people in the crowd leaned toward each other, whispering. One coach asked who that guy was. No one answered. A few just nodded. Outside, AJ sat on the hood of his car and breathed in the cool air. The sky was starting to turn. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady. It wasn't a return to glory. It was a return to balance. And this time, that was enough. The room was still as the match began. No music, no chants, just the sharp squeak of bare feet on mat. AJ stepped forward with a calm breath. His opponent bounced in place, light on his toes, smirking. His hands moved in quick, flashy feints, meant to show speed to draw the crowd. AJ didn't respond. He stood, centered eyes, steady. The first strike came fast, a looping hook aimed to rattle. AJ didn't block hard. He leaned just far enough for it to miss, then reset his stance. The opponent laughed, slapped his own chest, and circled like a showman. He was fighting the room as much as he was fighting AJ. Another flurry followed. Kicks back fists, spinning moves rehearsed more for cameras than for contact. AJ absorbed them without panic. A block here, a shift there. His counters were clean sharp when needed, but never more than required. He wasn't trying to win the moment. He was trying to stay true. Each time the opponent shouted or taunted, AJ's silence grew heavier. At one point, after missing a wild strike, the man sneered and spat words meant to cut. Something cruel, something personal, the kind of thing designed to provoke. AJ didn't flinch. He let the insult pass through him like smoke. Then, softly, just above the hum of the room, he spoke. Not to the man, not to the crowd, to the space between them. You're just not seeing it. The opponent blinked confused. The room seemed to pause. AJ stepped forward. His strike wasn't hard, just placed. A palm to the ribs, a guiding hand, the wrist a sweep to shift weight. His opponent stumbled, not from power, but from his own imbalance. AJ didn't chase. He waited. They circled again. The younger man's face twisted, not in pain, but frustration. His taunts faded. He tried to re-engage with the same fire, but it landed wrong now. He looked at AJ and saw nothing to grip. No anger, no ego, just stillness. Another exchange. AJ moved with patience. He let the rhythm come to him. Every strike was purposeful. Like punctuation in a sentence only he understood. He didn't rush. He didn't retreat. He remained. The final moment came not with a knockout, but with a pause. His opponent stepped in again, half-heartedly, worn down by his own urgency. AJ met him with a single block, then lowered his hand. The message was clear. It's over. The ref stepped between them. Match ended. AJ bowed. His opponent hesitated, then followed. The crowd stayed quiet for a long beat. Not from boredom, from something else. Something closer to understanding. AJ left the mat without raising his arms. He didn't look for applause. He walked to the edge, picked up his bag, and took a seat on the floor. Alone. And for the first time in a long time, he felt completely whole. The final point landed not with a shout or a crash, but with the light sound of skin brushing fabric. A clean strike to the body. Clear. Unforced. The referee stepped in and raised a hand. The match was over. There was no roar from the crowd. Just a quiet wave of breath, like something had ended and begun all at once. AJ bowed to his opponent, low and full. The younger man hesitated, then mirrored him, eyes down. No handshake, no celebration. Just a shared moment of respect. AJ turned and walked off the mat without lifting his arms or glancing at the scoreboard. There was no camera crew trailing him, no hype man calling his name. He walked like a man who had nothing left to prove. The crowd slowly began to clap. Not loudly, not like a concert. It was the kind of applause that built from recognition, not thrill. Teachers clapped. Older martial artists nodded. A few veterans in the back stood quietly. They weren't cheering for the win. They were honoring the way it was earned. One of the older commentators leaned toward the mic, voice low and rough with emotion. This isn't a comeback. It's a resurrection. AJ sat at the edge of the floor, pulling the tape from his fingers. His breathing was steady. His eyes didn't search for anyone. He folded his GI jacket over his lap and sat there as if time had slowed to meet him. Someone snapped a photo from far off. It wasn't dramatic. Just AJ is sitting with his head bowed, hands resting on his knees, and the light is catching the edge of his sleeve. That photo would later find its way online. People wouldn't share it because of the win. They'd share it because of the stillness. No trophy was raised. No interview followed. AJ left the gym through the side exit and walked to his car alone. The evening air met him like an old friend. He opened the door, placed his bag in the back seat, and paused. For a moment, he looked back at the building. The sounds inside had faded. His heart didn't race. His thoughts were quiet. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt whole. The drive was quiet. AJ didn't turn on the music. The road stretched ahead, with the late afternoon sun painting long shadows across the dashboard. His hands rested lightly on the wheel. He wasn't rushing toward anything. He was following a feeling. When he pulled into the gravel lot, the building stood the same as it always had. Modest, weathered. The wood along the edges had faded to gray. The sign above the door was barely legible now, but he didn't need to read it. He knew where he was. He stepped out and walked up to the entrance. The windows were dark. He didn't try the handle. He already knew it was locked. Still, he stood there for a long moment, breathing in the stillness. Then he stepped back, removed his shoes, and knelt in front of the door. No one saw him. No one took a photo. It wasn't a performance. It was a gesture. Quiet. Intentional. The ground beneath him was cool. He bowed slowly, hands to the floor. There was no voice inside his head. No memory playing in slow motion. Just breathe. He stayed there for a while. Then, as he reached down to slide his shoes back on, he noticed something near the base of the doorframe. A thin fold of paper, barely peeking out from under the wood. He pulled it free and opened it gently. The paper was soft with age, the edges slightly curled. It held just one sentence. You've opened your eyes. Now keep them open. No name? No mark? No hint of who had written it? AJ smiled. He folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. Not for posting, not for proof, just to carry. As he walked back to the car, the wind picked up slightly. The leaves along the edge of the building rustled like they had been holding their breath. AJ didn't look back when he started the engine. He didn't need to. He knew the door was still there. And that was enough. The path was still open. And this time, he was ready to walk it with his eyes open. Always. The room wasn't fancy. The mats were borrowed, and the paint on the walls had seen better years. A row of folding chairs lined the edge, some occupied by quiet parents, others stacked in the corner. The scent of floor cleaner and old wood hung faintly in the air, but the space felt right. AJ stood at the front in a plain black GI. No patches, no belt displayed, just calm posture and steady breath. His students, a small group of kids, and a few adults, stood facing him in silence. The first thing they learned wasn't a punch or a kick. It was how to breathe, how to stand still. How do you bow with intent, not just movement? Above the mirror, at the back of the room, 2 black and white photos hung in quiet honor. One was of Saito Sensei, the teacher who gave AJ his first stance. The other was Chuck Norris, his last teacher, without ever claiming the title. Between them hung a small wooden sign with hand-painted words, "We don't fight. We remember." Each time a student walked in, they bowed toward the wall. Not out of habit, out of respect. AJ didn't explain the sign unless someone asked. Most didn't need to. Classes were simple. They began and ended the same way. Silence, breath, posture, then movement. The drills were slow, patient, and precise. Children who had once been restless grew quieter. Adults who came with stiffness left walking a little lighter. One evening, a boy around 10 stayed behind to help sweep the mat. AJ thanked him. The boy asked why they didn't spar more. AJ smiled and answered without turning dramatic. "First, we learn not to hit. Then we learn when." He said no more. The boy nodded like he understood. Word of the class spread, but not through ads or videos. It moved from neighbor to neighbor. One parent told another. A middle school teacher referred a restless student. A local vet stopped by, then came back the next week with a quiet grin. There were no belts on display. Students earned them, but AJ didn't make them the focus. He often said, "Your belt isn't what people see. It's how you move when they don't." Each lesson he gave now came from a place he had once ignored. Every drill carried echoes of what had once humbled him, and every time he stood in silence at the start of class, he felt both of his teachers beside him. He wasn't just building fighters. He was helping people remember who they could be. And in that, he had become what he once needed most, a teacher. Luther arrived just before the afternoon class ended. He stood near the door, leaning on his cane, watching the last few bow out and shuffle into their shoes. AJ noticed him nodded once, then returned to stacking the pads along the wall. No one asked for pictures. No one made a fuss. The students filed out in silence, leaving the dojo bathed in the soft hum of its own stillness. They didn't sit in chairs. Luther dropped slowly to the mat with a quiet grunt, and AJ sat across from him, cross-legged. Between them sat a small handheld recorder Luther pulled from his jacket pocket. He didn't test it or check the battery. He just set it down gently, as if the conversation it would hold had already mattered. He didn't lead with a warm-up question. He looked AJ in the eye and asked plainly, "What changed you the most?" AJ looked past him for a moment. He didn't answer right away. He didn't shift in place or fidget with his belt. When he spoke, his voice was steady. The silence. That's where I finally heard what martial arts had been trying to tell me. Luther gave a slow nod. He didn't take notes, just listened. AJ kept talking his voice low, like he was saying it more to himself than the recorder. He said, when he first started, everything was noise. He wanted to be seen, heard, and followed. He thought movement was the point, the flash, the speed, the strike. But it was the still moments that lasted. The breath before a block. The pause before a word. The quiet of losing and not defending yourself with excuses. He said the fight that changed him didn't happen in a ring. It happened when he stood still and let the anger pass when he didn't need to win. When he realized someone was watching him, not to see what he could do, but who he could become. Luther didn't interrupt. He watched AJ like someone watching the weather change, slowly, naturally. No rush. AJ said he used to think silence was empty, but silence is where your real thoughts speak, where your teachers' voices live long after they're gone, where your next choice waits. He looked down at the mat between them. Right here, I used to stand just to show off. Now I kneel here and remember who taught me to stand at all. Luther exhaled deep and low. He clicked the recorder off, even though the tape could have run longer. That's enough, he said. There were no follow-up questions, no headline quotes, no sound bites. Just a man who'd asked and a man who'd answered. They sat there a while longer, saying nothing. Outside, someone's car started. The late sun cast soft shadows on the floor. Before Luther left, he turned back at the door and said softly, "You turned out to be the right story, after all." AJ gave a small nod, not in thanks, but in understanding. When the door shut behind him, the room was quiet again. And that quiet carried more than words ever could. The video wasn't announced. It wasn't posted by a network or a fan page. It appeared quietly on an old forum used mostly by retired martial artists and teachers. The file name was simple: Final Lesson. It opened with the sound of a wooden floor creaking and soft laughter. The camera was handheld, a little shaky, pointed toward a small, warmly lit dojo. No crowd, no banners. Just Chuck Norris, kneeling beside a boy who couldn't quite tie his belt right. He didn't correct him quickly. He waited. Let the boy try, then gently stepped in with quiet hands and kind eyes. His voice was soft, almost too soft for the microphone. He said, "Left over right, then under." Just like that. The boy smiled when the knot held. Chuck nodded once, not as approval, but as presence. The camera held steady now, and Chuck turned to face it. His knees rested on the mat. His back is straight. No GI patches, no belt displayed. Just him. Still. Familiar. He looked into the lens for a moment before he spoke. The world's loud now. His voice carried no weight of command. Just calm. Everyone shouting, selling, proving. He paused, looked down for a second, then back up. "But truth," he whispers. He let the words settle, then added softly, "Learn to listen." That was all. He stood, slowly, walked across the mat, and knelt again, this time in front of a faded portrait hung low on the wall. The photo showed a man, older than time, in a GI too big for his frame, with sharp eyes behind a quiet smile. Chuck bowed to the portrait, his head lowering with full gravity. Then he rose and walked out of frame. No goodbye. No final pose. The clip ended there. Within hours, the video had spread. Not through ads, not through reels. It moved from inbox to inbox, from sensei to student, from veteran to grandson. A silent current. It didn't trend. It didn't need to. Those who understood shared it. Those who shared it didn't need to say why. And those who watched listened. Not for the man, but for the whisper.